Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was not born a monster. History facts remind us that he was once hailed as the golden boy of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a beacon of hope in the aftermath of emperors plagued by paranoia, cruelty, and eccentricity. At just 17, Nero ascended to the Roman throne, a moment in world history thick with anticipation. The boy emperor, with his soft features and poet's heart, was seen by many as the embodiment of a new beginning in those early years. Ancient Rome, still smarting from the infamous reigns of Tiberius and Caligula, dared to dream. Citizens whispered about a return to order and reason, a resurrection of forgotten history. And with Seneca the Younger and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, guiding his steps, Nero's early rule offered flashes of brilliance. Reforms were announced, taxes eased, and performances were poetic rather than brutal. The people cheered what they believed to be a philosopher king, someone worthy of the annals of ancient history. But the winds of history mysteries often carry secrets, and even in this so-called golden dawn, shadows loomed. Nero's rise to power had not been a clean affair. Orchestrated by his mother, Agrippina the Younger, a figure woven tightly into the web of historical mysteries. His ascent was marked by manipulation and ambition. Agrippina's influence over Nero was absolute. She had married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius, and allegedly hastened his death with a poisoned dish of mushrooms to place her son on the throne. It was a tale of bizarre history, one fit for the archives of historical documentaries. Agrippina saw Nero not as a ruler, but as a vessel. She envisioned herself as the true power behind the throne, guiding him through the labyrinth of Rome's political arena. She sat behind curtains during audiences, issued orders in his name, and positioned her allies in key roles. In many ways, this was a tale of ancient civilizations repeating old patterns, mothers who raised kings, then ruled through them. Nero, however, was not content to be a marionette. As he matured, so too did his thirst for autonomy. While trivia often highlights his obsession with the arts, it was his desire for independence that first disturbed the political balance. Agrippina's grip tightened as she sensed her control slipping. She opposed his love affairs, mocked his performances, and reminded him publicly of her role in his rise. Conflict brewed. It was no longer a simple family quarrel, but a war between power and pride. Nero's defiance grew, and with it, a subtle erosion of boundaries. Seneca's counsel was increasingly ignored. Agrippina was banished from the palace, her presence declared intolerable. She had become, in Nero's eyes, an obstacle to be removed, another relic of a past he wished to bury beneath his own legend. This marked the first true turning point in Nero's story, one of those mysterious events where personal ambition collides with the course of history education. When Nero ordered Agrippina's assassination, lesser-known history was forever altered. Whether it was through a collapsing boat or a final dagger in the dark, the deed was done. And in that act, Nero devoured the first of his metaphorical diamonds, the sacred bond between mother and child. This was no ordinary power struggle. It was a symbolic feast of ego over ethics. Rome watched, horrified, yet transfixed. The people whispered of madness and majesty, of an emperor with the soul of an artist and the heart of a tyrant. Nero had declared himself no longer a boy, but a god in the making. He would not build aqueducts or lead legions. He would compose verse, perform tragedies, and reshape Rome not through war, but through spectacle. In that vision lay the seeds of strange history, the kind passed down through tales and scrolls, through History Channel specials and fun history facts alike. The death of Agrippina signaled the start of a new age, one where every boundary moral, familial, political was merely a stage prop, and Nero, Rome's most theatrical emperor, had only begun the performance of his lifetime. The public, enamored with Nero's artistic flair, remained blind to the us, cracks forming beneath the surface. Roman poets compared him to Apollo, and statues were raised not in military garb, but in theatrical robes. His voice, though feeble, was applauded as divine. Fun history facts circulated tales of Nero refusing to eat until he had written a new verse, of him weeping at the end of a tragedy. These curious anecdotes became the ornaments of his mythos, feeding a legacy built on illusion. Even the Senate, the historic bastion of Roman tradition, found itself enthralled or intimidated. Those who dared to question Nero's priorities, his neglect of infrastructure, his obsession with performance, his reliance on omens and astrologers, were quickly silenced. It was a weird history taking shape, one where logic bowed to drama, and governance became a stage dot. As Agrippina's voice was extinguished, so too was the last voice of restraint. The empire watched a youth transform into something unrecognizable, and though the temples still burned incense in his honor, the air in Rome was thick with unease. The golden boy of Rome had taken his throne not to serve history, but to rewrite it for better or for worse. By the time Nero's rule entered its middle years, the golden luster that had once surrounded his image had begun to dull. The young emperor, who had once been hailed as Rome's poetic promise, was now drawing uneasy glances. Beneath the theatrics and verses, the Senate began to detect something darker aslow, creeping madness born of unchecked power and obsessive vanity. It was here, in the shadow of Agrippina's assassination, that Nero's transformation accelerated. What had once been the playful indulgence of a youth fascinated with performance was becoming a compulsive desire for adoration. He no longer sought approval. He demanded worship. The boundaries between emperor and artist began to vanish, replaced by a single terrifying persona, Nero the divine performer. According to history facts, he began holding private concerts, then public ones. He sang tragedies, played the lyre, and forced Rome's elite to attend, sometimes for hours at a time. Senators who had once commanded legions now clapped through bloody fingers, afraid that a poorly timed yawn could be construed as treason. These episodes weren't merely eccentric. They were the foundations of a bizarre history, an unraveling that would eventually consume the Roman court. The Roman people, fascinated by historical curiosities, were initially amused. But entertainment turned into coercion. Participation became mandatory, and applause became an act of survival. Nero, in his madness, hired professional claqueurs applauders, whose job was to ensure that no performance ended in silence. He bathed in their praise, oblivious to the fear behind the smiles. This shift in behavior was more than mere vanity. It marked the beginning of Nero's symbolic consumption of Rome's soul. He didn't just want to govern the empire, he wanted to transform it into a stage. World history had never seen a ruler so determined to blend personal fantasy with national identity. In his eyes, Rome's citizens were not people. They were an audience. Even as whispers of discontent grew louder, Nero's obsession deepened. He adorned himself in elaborate Greek robes, referenced himself as Apollo, and filled his palace with poets, musicians, and sycophants. Seneca, once his moral compass, was now viewed with suspicion. Boris had died, leaving no one left to balance Nero's growing megalomania. The throne had become a mirror one that reflected only what Nero wished to see. The empire's administration faltered. Grain shortages emerged. Roads went unrepaired. Taxes increased to fund ever more elaborate spectacles. And yet, the emperor remained locked in his performance. History trivia tells us he once performed in a theater for days without stopping, barring citizens from leaving even for childbirth or funerals. Rome had become a prison of performance, and its people, unwilling actors in a never-ending tragedy. These events were not isolated incidents. They were history mysteries in the making, the sort of inexplicable descents that would confound future scholars and populate historical documentaries. The contrast was stark. A city begging for stability and a ruler chasing shadows of artistic glory. One cannot ignore the ancient history of Rome's emperors to understand Nero's decline. His predecessors had wielded cruelty with calculation. Tiberius ruled from shadows, Caligula from madness, Claudius through intellect. Nero chose theater. His tyranny was not hidden behind walls, but paraded on stage. It was open, flamboyant, and disturbingly sincere. Behind closed doors, his paranoia festered. Letters from governors were ignored. Reports of famine and rebellion were dismissed. Nero's Rome was not the Rome of the people. It was a Rome of illusions. The emperor fed on praise, and when it didn't come naturally, he manufactured it. To preserve his fantasy, he would betray allies, silence critics, and eventually burn a city itself. These were no longer the quirks of a misunderstood artist. They were symptoms of an empire unraveling, of a leader slipping into delusion. Nero was consuming diamonds now, not just symbols of wealth, but of dignity, of freedom, of shared truth. And as he devoured the soul of Rome, the world braced for the inferno that was yet to come. The transformation of Nero into a tyrant artist was not just a tragic curiosity. It was one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of imperial psychology. How could a man once tutored in stoic virtue and philosophy fall so completely into the abyss of megalomania? The answer lies, perhaps, in the intoxicating blend of unrestrained power and theatrical delusion. This was a ruler who began to believe his own mythology. Statues of Nero multiplied across the empire, not as military conqueror, but as divine muse. He began to compose odes to himself, inscribing verses that declared his voice more powerful than Orpheus, his soul more luminous than any star. These proclamations were not satire, they were law, and to oppose them was to commit sacrilege against the emperor's living divinity. Historical stories tell us that Nero's own palace became a shrine to his vanity. He installed mirrored corridors, so his image would reflect endlessly. He demanded that his name be included in religious hymns. The Roman elite, trapped in this surreal reality, became performers themselves, clapping, smiling, and praising with empty eyes. This is what made Nero's reign one of strange history, a page from the History Channel that feels too theatrical to be true, and yet every decree, every performance, every public humiliation bore the weight of imperial authority. Nero was no longer content with being loved. He had to be worshipped. And in that worship, Rome began to lose itself, as the curtain fell on this era of vanity. The stage was set for a far more literal and devastating performance. The fire that would consume Rome and ignite Nero's final act of madness. In the scorching summer of 64 CE, Rome, jewel of the ancient world, ignited not just in flames, but in the annals of world history. What began as a blaze near the Circus Maximus would become one of the most devastating and controversial events of ancient history. The Great Fire of Rome, consuming the city over 6 relentless days and 7 dreadful nights, still smolders. In the ashes of historical mysteries, wooden tenements, densely packed and tinder dry, became the perfect fuel. The fire leapt across rooftops, fed by winds and chaos, swallowing temples, homes, and statues alike. The Forum, the heart of Roman identity, flickered with heat and horror. The cries of the dying and the crumbling of stone mingled in a grotesque symphony of destruction. As smoke choked the heavens, even seasoned senators wept Rome was dying, and no one knew why. Whispers began immediately, like smoke curling beneath locked doors. Some claimed it was accident, others divine wrath. But most damning were the rumors. Nero, the emperor himself, had started the blaze. It was said that from his villa in Antium, or perhaps from one of the city's towers, he watched as flames devoured the eternal city, playing his lyre and singing of Troy's fall. Whether true or forged, the image stuck a tale of weird history, too terrible to forget. This act, if it occurred, remains one of the unsolved mysteries of Rome. Did Nero truly compose while his people burned? Or was this simply the public's revenge, a narrative crafted by despair and rage? Regardless of his exact whereabouts, what followed was indisputable. Nero returned to a ruined city and stepped into a role more actor than leader. He wore common clothes, opened his palace gardens to the homeless, and slashed grain prices. But these gestures, intended as relief, rang hollow. They were perceived not as compassion, but as choreography. Rome needed a savior. Nero gave them. A scapegoat. The emperor, according to history facts, soon accused the Christians, a strange, secretive sect with foreign rituals and defiant gods. They were outsiders, unprotected by tradition, and thus ideal for blame. In one of history's darkest events, Nero unleashed a purge unlike any before. Christians were rounded up and publicly tortured in scenes that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. And many, in perhaps the most chilling display of imperial cruelty, were set ablaze, used as human torches to light Nero's gardens. These events weren't merely executions. They were imperial theater, and Rome, still shuddering from the fire, was forced to applaud. Nero's need for performance had found a new stage: suffering. The line between art and atrocity vanished, and in its place emerged a new form of rule tyranny wrapped in pageantry, horror cloaked in elegance. Yet even these monstrous acts couldn't mask the emperor's deeper motive. For beneath the charred ruins of Rome lay opportunity. Vast tracts of land, once homes and marketplaces, were cleared by fire. And where others saw rubble, Nero saw canvas. He announced the construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, his architectural magnum opus. It would stretch across the Palatine and Esquiline hills, covering hundreds of acres. This wasn't a palace. It was a dreamscape. It had vineyards, forests, lakes, and a 120-foot statue of himself. History secrets tell us of spinning dining, rooms, jeweled ceilings, and halls perfumed by hidden fountains. It was a temple not to Rome, but to Nero's ego. This was no reconstruction. This was reclamation. Nero had consumed the literal fabric of the city and reshaped it in his image. It was the most audacious moment of his madness and majesty, and the people saw it for what it was. He wasn't rebuilding for them. He was building for himself. The cost was catastrophic. The public treasury, already strained, was bled dry. Taxes rose. Discontent surged. Senators grumbled in private, generals in distant provinces watched with concern, and ordinary Romans whispered in the streets. The fire had scarred more than the city. It had exposed the emperor's soul. A soul gilded, self-obsessed, and now irreversibly detached from the people it was meant to serve. And as Rome smoldered, its emperor danced. And so, the Domus Aurea rose from the ashes like a gilded phoenix, but its splendor only deepened the public wound. What was once shared civic space now belonged to a singular man. The avenues that had echoed with the footsteps of Roman citizens for generations were now marble walkways reserved for the emperor's vanity. Historical stories tell of guests brought into rooms that spun like the heavens, ceilings that rained, down rose petals, and feasts where gold was eaten from gold. The line between architecture and illusion dissolved, and while some were dazzled, most were simply appalled. This was no longer a ruler building monuments for Rome's glory. It was a man indulging in a bizarre history of personal worship. Even in the provinces, word of the emperor's decadence spread like embers on wind. Governors wrote back in code, afraid of spies. Philosophers whispered warnings in back alleys. The empire was uneasy, and all roads led to Rome to its ruins. and to the golden specter that had taken its place. What the fire destroyed was not just wood and stone. It raised the illusion that Nero governed for Rome, and with every brick of the Domus Aurea, every fun history fact whispered through scandal, the people began to see Nero had not rebuilt the city. He had rewritten it for himself alone, and as the smoke finally cleared from the scorched skyline, the people of Rome stared not at a city reborn, but at a theater reimagined. Nero, enthroned in his Domus Aurea, had turned tragedy into opportunity, suffering into stagecraft. He did not walk among his people with humility or grief. He glided above them, wrapped in silk, perfumed and praised, the emperor who fed on applause more than duty. His palace magnificent, monstrous stood as the monstrous stood, ultimate testament to what Rome had become under his rule. A city no longer shaped by the will of its citizens, but by the ego of one man. The fire, so often remembered for its physical destruction, had in truth revealed a deeper devastation of civic spirit, of shared identity, of the fragile bonds that once tethered emperors to the governed. In every era of world history, there are moments where power tests the soul of a civilization. Nero's Rome was one such crucible. The Great Fire remains a symbol, not just of destruction, but of transformation, the point at which one man's fantasy eclipsed an empire's reality. This story, buried within the scrolls of forgotten history, and recounted across historical documentaries, endures not because of its spectacle, but because of its warning. It is a reminder that leadership without empathy, vision without accountability, and art without humanity can consume more than cities. They can consume civilizations. Rome did not just lose buildings in the fire. It lost part of its identity. And in the golden glow of Nero's house, the empire saw not its future, but the haunting glitter of a crown made of diamonds already crumbling into dust.